The stagecoach didn't so much arrive as surrender. It rolled into Graybell on a Thursday afternoon with the particular exhaustion of something that had been moving too long through too much emptiness. And when it finally stopped, the dust it carried kept going for a few seconds longer, drifting forward like it hadn't gotten the message yet. Eveline Marsh was the only passenger who stepped down onto that street. She stood on the packed earth with a single valise in her hand and took one slow breath of the air, which smelled of dry grass and iron and the faint sweetness of something blooming just out of sight. The town of Graybell arranged itself before her in the way that frontier towns always did, as though someone had drawn a main street with a ruler and then let everything else happen by accident. A general store, a feed merchant, a small church with a bell that hung without a rope, a scattering of houses beyond, some with gardens, some without, all of them squinting into the afternoon light. She had been traveling for 11 days. She had not slept well for most of them. What she felt standing there was not arrival. It was something closer to the moment just before a decision. That narrow space between the last breath of one life and the first breath of whatever came next. She had been living in that space for longer than she could say. She had simply learned to move through it without letting it show on her face. A man was standing at the far edge of the street. He was watching her the way a person watches weather. Not with alarm, not with welcome, but with a kind of careful attention, reading something in the way she held herself, in the single valise, in the precise stillness of her posture. He was tall and broad across the shoulders in the way that comes not from effort but from years of work, and his face had the quality of landscape that has been through many seasons without complaint. He wore a hat that had been dark once and was now the color of old wood, and his hands, even from a distance, looked like the hands of someone who had never once considered what they looked like. He walked toward her with a gait that was economical, no wasted motion, no performance of welcome. He stopped at a distance that was polite but not warm, and he looked at her for a moment before he looked at the valise. "You brought one bag," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected. Not unkind, simply factual, the way a man states the weather. "I didn't have many things worth bringing," Eveline replied. That was more honest than she had intended to be. She watched him register it, the small shift behind his eyes, not surprise exactly, but something that took note. He looked away before she could read it further. "Wagons this way," he said, and turned. She followed him. His name was Jasper Holt. She knew that from the letters, or what had passed for letters, brief and functional exchanges that had told her almost nothing about him as a person, and almost everything about him as a man who did not know what to say to a stranger about himself. The letters had told her the ranch ran cattle on good land. The letters had told her the house had 2 rooms, with a wood stove and a proper roof. The letters had told her there was work enough for 2 people if 2 people chose to do it. They had not told her why a man with a good ranch and a proper roof needed to advertise for a wife in an Eastern paper. She had not asked. She had not been in a position to ask questions that might reveal how little leverage she had. The wagon was a working wagon, solid and undecorated, hitched to a bay horse that stood with its head down in the particular patience of an animal that has been waiting in harness long enough to stop expecting anything. Jasper loaded her valise into the back with one motion and climbed to the seat without looking to see if she needed help. She climbed up herself and settled beside him, and they sat at the edge of town for a moment while he checked the buckles on the harness with the focus of someone who checks such things whether or not anyone is watching. Then he clicked his tongue, and the horse moved, and Graybell slid past them and away. The road out of town ran through country that opened gradually, the way a held breath releases, until there was nothing on any side but grass and sky and the low purple line of hills in the far distance. The grass moved in long, slow waves, and the light was the particular gold of late afternoon that makes even plain things look significant. Eveline watched it. She did not try to fill the silence. She had learned in the years of her marriage that silence between two people could mean many things. It could mean comfort, or it could mean distance, or it could mean that both people had simply run out of ways to reach each other across a space that kept widening no matter what they said. She had lived in that last kind of silence for a long time. She had gotten very good at occupying it without disappearing into it. This silence was different. She couldn't place how yet. "How long is the road?" she asked, not because she cared about the answer, but because she wanted to hear how he answered. The way a person responds to a small question tells you more than the answer to a large one. 3 miles, Jasper said. Less if the creek's low enough to cross direct. And is it? He glanced at the sky. Today it is. He said nothing else, but she noticed that he had looked up before answering, reading something in the color or the light or the movement of the air. She did not know what he had read there, but she registered that he had read something, that he was a man who looked at the world as though it was always telling him something worth knowing. She stored that away. It was a habit she had carried from her years as a weaver, the instinct to note the quality of a thread before deciding how to use it. You could not know what something would become until you understood what it was made of. The ranch came into view over a low rise, and Eveline looked at it with eyes she tried to keep neutral. The house was stone and timber, 2 stories, with a porch that ran along the front and windows that caught the last of the afternoon light. It was not a beautiful house in the way that things designed to be beautiful are beautiful. It was beautiful the way that things built to last become beautiful over time, through the slow accumulation of use and care. The barn was newer than the house and painted red in the way that only people who care about a place bother to paint barns. There was a chicken coop. There was a well with a proper cover. There were fence lines running out in 3 directions, and they were straight. A man who keeps straight fence lines is a man who does not do things halfway. She noticed something else. The fence along the western side, closest to the house, was newly painted. Not repainted over old paint, but painted over bare wood, as though the planks themselves were new. The contrast was subtle but visible, the way something recently replaced always stands slightly apart from what surrounds it. And beside the barn, stacked in careful rows, were wooden crates, the kind used for packing, the kind used for moving things out. She looked at them for just a moment, long enough to understand them, and then she looked away. Jasper helped her down from the wagon, which surprised her because he had not helped her up, and she understood that whatever courtesy he was offering her was not about performance. It was something quieter than that. He took her valise from the back and carried it to the front door and set it on the porch, and then he opened the door and stood back to let her through first. The inside of the house was clean. That was the first thing she noticed, and it mattered, because cleanliness in a house where a man has lived alone is never accidental. It is a choice made every day, a small private act of refusal against the entropy that loneliness invites. The floors were swept. The kitchen table had been wiped. There was a jar of dried wildflowers on the windowsill that had lost their color but kept their shape. She looked at them for a moment. "Neighbor brought those," Jasper said from behind her. "That was kind," she said. "She's a kind woman." Eveline set her coat on the hook by the door and turned to look at the room properly. It was a sparse room, but not an empty one. There were books on the shelf beside the hearth. Real books, worn and consulted, not decorative. There was a rug on the floor that had been made by hand, the pattern irregular in the way that handmade things are irregular, each row slightly different from the last as the maker's tension shifted. There was a rocking chair by the window that faced west. Everything in the room had been used. Nothing in the room was new. Except, she noticed, the curtains on the eastern window. Those were new. The fold lines from the fabric were still faintly visible, the way freshly hung cloth holds the memory of being folded. Someone had hung new curtains before she arrived. She looked at them and felt something move in her chest that she did not have a word for yet. Jasper showed her the room upstairs where she would sleep. It was small and had a low ceiling that slanted with the roofline, and the window looked out over the eastern pasture where 3 horses stood in the late light like punctuation. There was a bed with a quilt that had been washed recently. She could tell by the way the colors were slightly brighter than the fabric itself, and a small table with a candle, and on the table a single blossom in a tin cup, one of the same dried wildflowers from the kitchen, placed there separately, deliberately. The door had a lock, a small iron latch on the inside, the kind that could only be set from within. She touched it with one finger. It turned smoothly. Someone had oiled it recently. She stood in the middle of that small room with the slanting ceiling and the view of the horses and the dried flower in the tin cup, and she felt the familiar pressure of not knowing what to make of something she had not expected. She had come here with very modest expectations. She had come here expecting to be useful, to work, to occupy a role that needed occupying, and in return to be somewhere that was not where she had been. She had not come here expecting curtains. She had not come expecting a lock. She did not know yet what those things meant about the man downstairs. But she noted them. Dinner that evening was practical and adequate. Jasper cooked without ceremony salt pork and cornbread and beans that had been soaking since the day before, and he set it on the table and sat down and ate with the focused quiet of someone who eats to continue rather than for pleasure. Eveline ate across from him, and they spoke perhaps 12 sentences between them, none of which were about anything that mattered, and she found that she did not mind. She had eaten thousands of meals at a table where the conversation covered everything except what was true, and this silence, at least, was not pretending to be something else. After dinner, she washed the plates and he disappeared outside to check on something in the barn, and she stood at the kitchen window in the last gray light and looked at the yard. That was when she saw it. Behind the house, past the woodpile, and a little to the south, there was a gate in the fence. The fence itself was unremarkable, the kind of low post and rail that marks the edge of a kitchen garden. But the gate was standing open, and beyond it was a space that stopped her. It had been a garden once. The bones of it were still there, the way the bones of something beautiful remain even after everything else is gone. The beds had been dug with intention, the borders shaped by someone who knew what they were doing, who had planned where the light would fall and where the shade would gather. There were the dry stalks of plants that had gone to seed and never been harvested. There were the traces of paths between the beds, still faintly visible where feet had worn the grass down. there was a small wooden bench against the fence, and though it had gone gray with weather, it had been built solidly. The kind of bench built for sitting in, not for show. The whole space had the quality of something that had been loved and then abandoned, and the abandonment had the particular weight of something that happened not gradually, but all at once. Eveline pushed the gate open and walked in. The ground was soft under her boots, softer than the hard-packed earth of the yard. Even overgrown, the soil here held something the surrounding land didn't. Years of attention, years of amendment, a quality of care that outlasted the caring. She crouched down and pressed her fingers into the earth beside one of the dry stalks and felt it give, rich and dark, still alive in the way that tended earth stays alive long after the hands that tended it are gone. She did not know why she started pulling weeds. She had no plan to do it. Her hands simply began, the way hands do when the body knows something the mind hasn't caught up to yet. She pulled one weed, then another, clearing a small circle around the base of a stalk that might or might not have anything left worth saving. The work was quiet and specific, and it required exactly enough attention to crowd out everything else, and that was what she needed in that moment without knowing she needed it. She worked until the light was nearly gone. When she stood and turned, Jasper was at the gate. She did not know how long he had been there. He was leaning against the post with his arms crossed, watching her with an expression that was difficult to read, something between stillness and recognition, as though he was seeing something he had not expected to see and was deciding what to do about it. She looked at him. She looked at the small, cleared circle of earth around the dry stalk. "I didn't ask," she said. "No," he said. He looked at the cleared patch for a moment. Then he looked back at her. "The bench doesn't rock. One leg is shorter than the others." He paused. "I keep meaning to fix it." She did not know why he told her that. She did not ask. She walked past him back toward the house, and he followed, and they went inside without another word. That night, in her small room with a slanting ceiling, Eveline lay on the quilt and looked at the shadows on the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the house, the wood settling, the wind at the window, and below, after a time, the sound of footsteps. She had not imagined it. That first night she had heard him moving. Jasper walked in the small hours of the morning, not restlessly, not the pacing of a man who could not sleep, but slowly, with direction, from the kitchen to a point somewhere in the front room that she could not place, and there he would stop, and stand, in the silence. She did not know what he stood before. She did not know what he looked at in the dark. She only knew that a man who moves through his house in the small hours of the morning and stands in one place without a candle is a man carrying something too heavy to put down and too familiar to explain. She knew something about that kind of weight. She had carried her own version of it for 3 years. The particular burden of grief that does not look like grief because it has no shape. You can name, no clean edge, only a dull, constant pressure at the center of the chest that makes ordinary things feel slightly too far away. She did not light her candle. She lay still and listened to the silence of his standing, and eventually she slept. The second and third days passed in the rhythm of work. Eveline found her footing in the house by instinct, learning where things were kept, what needed doing, and in what order. The small grammar of a household that had been managed by one person for too long. She cooked better than Jasper had expected. She could tell by the way he paused the first morning when she set the biscuits on the table, not with surprise exactly, but with a kind of recalibration, a quiet adjustment of expectation. She did not make much of it. She simply put the biscuits on the table and poured the coffee and sat down. On the third day, he placed a stack of papers on the table after breakfast and sat across from her. She had been half waiting for this. She had seen the papers before, stacked on the shelf in the front room, and she had not looked at them directly because she did not yet know what they meant. Now she looked. They were documents, formal ones, with signatures already at the bottom of several pages, and spaces where other signatures were still needed. She read them with the same patience she brought to everything, the discipline of someone who has learned that understanding a thing fully is always worth the time it takes. She read for a long while. Jasper waited. He did not fidget. He did not explain. He simply waited with the particular stillness of a man who has made a decision and is now letting it move at its own pace. She finished reading. She set the papers down flat on the table and pressed her palms against them, not to hold them in place, but because she needed a moment with something solid under her hands. "You're selling the ranch," she said. "That's the plan," he said. She looked at the papers again. Then she looked at him. "These are co-ownership transfer documents. You need both names on the sale." "I do." She lifted her eyes to his face. He met her gaze without flinching, without apology, but also without the coldness that would have made it easier to feel what she wanted to feel about this. He simply looked at her, direct and still, and she understood that whatever he was doing, he was not pretending it was something else. She picked up the pen he had set beside the papers, and then she stopped. She held the pen above the line where her name was meant to go, and something in her would not complete the motion. It was not defiance. It was not calculation. It was something stranger and more involuntary than either of those things. It was her hand understanding something her mind was still working out. She set the pen down. "I'd like to see the property first," she said, "before I sign anything." Jasper looked at the pen. He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, something small and quick that she caught only because she had been watching for exactly that kind of thing. Then he nodded once, short and decisive. "All right," he said. He stood and took his hat from the hook. "I'll be in the barn." She sat at the table for a long moment after he left. She looked at the papers. She looked at the pen. Through the kitchen window, she could see a corner of the back fence, and beyond it, the edge of the gate that led into the garden. She thought about the bench with the short leg. She thought about the new curtains and the oiled lock. She thought about a man who prepares a room for a woman he is planning to use as a signature on a document, and who oils the lock on her door anyway, who hangs new curtains anyway, who sets a dried flower in a tin cup on her table, separately, deliberately, as though it mattered. She did not know what to make of Jasper Holt. That evening, she went back to the garden. The light was longer now, the sky a deep and complicated blue that held on past what felt reasonable, and she worked until her knees ached and her hands were dark with earth, and she had cleared nearly a third of one bed entirely, down to the bare soil, the kind of clearing that is also a kind of invitation. When she stood and looked back at the house, there was a lamp lit in the front room, and on the fence post at the gate, someone had left a new pair of work gloves. She picked them up. They were the right size. She stood at the gate of the abandoned garden in the last blue light of evening, holding a pair of gloves that fit her, on a ranch she had not yet agreed to leave, beside a house where a man was walking through the dark hours of the night towards something she could not yet see. And she thought, what kind of man prepares a space so carefully for a person he does not intend to keep? She had been in this space before, this narrow space between the last thing and the next thing. She had always moved through it by looking straight ahead and not asking what it was. This time, for a reason she could not name, she looked around. The grass moved in the last of the light. Somewhere past the barn, one of the horses made a sound, low and easy, the sound of an animal that is exactly where it expects to be. She put the gloves on. They fit. The week that followed had its own grammar, and Eveline learned it the way she had always learned the language of a new place, not by asking questions, but by paying attention to what repeated. Jasper rose before the light. That was the first constant. She would hear him on the stairs in the deep dark of pre-dawn, his boots on the wood, careful in the way that a person is careful around someone sleeping, which told her something about him that she filed away without analyzing yet. By the time she came down, the stove was already breathing heat, and there was water hot enough for coffee sitting in the pot on the back burner, and he was gone. He did not tell her he had done this. He simply did it. She began to understand that this was his primary language, not silence exactly, but action in the place of words. The quiet grammar of a man who had spent so long alone that the habits of consideration had turned inward, had become something he practiced for its own sake, with no audience in mind. The hot water was not a gesture. It was simply what he did. She began to do things in return, not as reciprocity, or not consciously as such. She simply noticed what needed doing and did it. She mended the tear in the curtain of the front room window. She reorganized the shelves in the pantry so that the things used daily were within easy reach rather than buried behind the things used rarely. She sharpened the kitchen knives, which had gone dull in the particular way that knives go dull when no one pays them any attention, and left them on the counter without saying anything about it. The third morning, Jasper picked up the paring knife to cut an apple, and he stopped for just a moment when the blade went through cleanly without effort. He did not look at her, but she saw the small pause, and she understood it for what it was. The days built on each other. She was not, she told herself, staying. She was simply not leaving yet. The next stagecoach did not pass through Graybell until the following Thursday, and there was no particular reason to stand at the side of the road and flag it down when she did not yet know where she would tell it to take her. She had signed none of the papers. Jasper had not asked again. This was, she recognized, its own kind of negotiation. Two people who had each come to this arrangement with a set of expectations, now finding that the expectations had not quite matched the reality, and neither of them was yet ready to say so out loud. There was something almost restful about it. She had lived for years in a marriage where things unsaid accumulated like sediment at the bottom of a river, slowing the current without ever stopping it entirely. This was different. The things unsaid here were not secrets being kept. They were simply truths not yet ready to be spoken, still forming themselves into the right shape. On the fourth day, it rained. It came in the afternoon without much warning, the way rain in that country sometimes did. A darkening of the western sky, and then a smell of metal in the air, and then the sound of it on the barn roof, like a conversation between strangers that keeps growing louder. Eveline was in the kitchen with the account books she had found on the pantry shelf, not reading them exactly, but looking at them. The way she looked at things when she was trying to understand something without making a decision about it yet. She had spent years as a weaver sitting across from ledgers that had to balance, and she had learned that numbers told stories if you knew how to read them. Not the story the numbers intended to tell, but the one they couldn't help telling. The story underneath. She heard the barn door, and then the sound of boots on the porch. And then Jasper came inside with his hat dark with rain and his shoulders damp, and something in his hands, a length of leather strapping that needed repair. And he sat down at the other end of the table and began to work on it without looking at her or the books. The rain made the kitchen smaller, not unpleasantly. It was the smallness of a space that knows it is keeping something out, and there was a kind of ease in it, the ease of two people who have stopped actively bracing against each other's presence. "You know how to read wind direction," Evelyn said after a time. It was not a question. She had been watching him for days, and she had seen the way his eyes went to the sky without effort, without thinking, the way you look at something that has never stopped talking to you. "Some of it," he said, working a knot in the leather. "The color of the morning light tells you more than the direction alone. What does this morning's light tell you?" He looked up then, briefly, with something in his expression that she might have called amusement if it had been slightly less contained. "That will be inside for a while." She looked out the window at the rain. "How do you know the difference between the light that means rain and the light that just looks like rain?" He set the leather down and looked at the window himself, as though reconsidering the question. "You don't, at first. You get it wrong. You learn by getting it wrong enough times that you start to notice what was different on the days you were right. And when do you stop getting it wrong?" He picked the leather back up. "You don't stop. You just start being wrong about smaller things." She looked at him for a moment. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the knot in the leather with the same quality of focused attention he gave everything, unhurried and direct, the attention of someone who has never learned to multitask because he has always considered whatever is in front of him to be worth all of him. She thought about writing that down somewhere. She thought about why she wanted to. Instead, she looked back at the account books. The numbers there told a story she had not expected. She had assumed, from the packing crates and the documents and the quiet purposefulness of a man preparing to leave, that the ranch was failing, that the sale was necessity rather than choice. She had built a quiet narrative around that assumption, the story of a man retreating from something that had become too much, selling his losses before they became unpayable. But the numbers did not tell that story. The numbers told the story of a ranch that was functioning, carefully and consistently, generating enough to maintain itself and a modest surplus besides. The cattle were profitable. The land was not in debt. Whatever Jasper Holt was selling, he was not selling failure. She looked at the numbers for a long time. She looked at the man across the table, working a knot out of a piece of leather with patient hands in a kitchen that smelled of rain and wood smoke, in a house with new curtains and a recently oiled lock and a stack of packing crates in the yard. She said nothing, but something in her understanding of the situation shifted, the way a picture shifts when you realize you have been looking at it from the wrong angle, and the thing you thought was background turns out to be what the whole image was about. The rain went on for most of the afternoon. At some point, Evelyn set aside the account books and pulled from her valise the small kit she always carried, a shuttle and a length of warp thread and enough wool to work a sample. Weaving required a loom, and she did not have one, but she could do the preliminary work anywhere, the winding, the measuring, the small preparations that existed before the work itself. She did this sometimes when she needed her hands occupied so her mind could move freely. It had always been her thinking posture. After a while, Jasper looked up. "What is that?" he asked. "Warp thread. I'm measuring a pattern." "For what?" "For nothing right now. I'm just working out the math of it." He watched her hands for a moment. "You weave." "My mother taught me." Her mother taught her. She did not look up from the thread. It's one of those things that moves through women like a conversation that's been going on longer than any one person can remember. He was quiet for a moment. "What does the math look like?" "In weaving." She did look up then, because the question surprised her. Not the asking of it, but the nature of it. That he had gone immediately to the structure, to the underlying logic, rather than the surface of the thing. "Like music," she said. "You establish a pattern and then you work variations on it. The interest is in the variation. The pattern itself is just the agreement you make at the beginning about what the rules are." He considered that. "And if you don't like the pattern you started with?" "You unravel and start again." She looked back at the thread. "It's less loss than it sounds like, most of the time." He did not say anything else, but she felt the quality of his attention remain on her for a moment before it returned to the leather, and she thought, he heard that differently than she had said it, and she was not sure which of them had understood it better. The rain stopped before supper, and the light that came after it was the specific gold of a world washed clean, every edge sharpened, the smell of the earth lifted and opened by the water. Evelyn went out onto the porch and stood in it for a moment, and she heard Jasper behind her, leaning against the door frame, and she pointed west without thinking about whether it was a presumptuous thing to do. "The sky there," she said. He looked. The western sky was the color of an ember, deep orange fading to a red that had almost too much feeling in it for a thing made entirely of light. "That's not a rain color," he said. "No," she agreed. "That's a tomorrow color." She didn't ask what he meant. She understood it without needing to. A tomorrow color was not a prediction. It was a quality of light that suggested continuation, that said the world intended to keep going and would likely be worth looking at when it did. She stood in that light for a moment longer and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, something quiet and undemanding that might, if she was not careful, turn into the beginning of wanting to stay somewhere. She went back inside before she could decide what to do about it. The following morning she went to town. She did not tell Jasper she was going. She simply walked the 3 miles to Graybell because she needed to see the town in the way you need to see a new place, without anyone beside you, without having to look at it through someone else's relationship to it. She wanted to see it as it was. It was small, and it was plain, and it had the particular quality of a place where people had decided to build something, and were still in the early stages of deciding whether it had been the right decision. There was a general store run by a man named Orvis, who had the kind of face that has seen most things and is politely unimpressed by the rest. There was a woman behind the counter of the dry goods side who looked at Evelyn with a sharp and immediate assessment of someone who has learned to read strangers quickly and is rarely wrong. "You're the woman out at the Holt place," the woman said. "I am," Evelyn said. "I'm Paulette." She did not extend her hand, but she did nod, which seemed to serve the same purpose. You settling in, all right? Well enough. Paulette looked at her for another moment with that same sharpened attention. He treating you decent? He's been respectful, Eveline said, which was true as far as it went. Paulette seemed to weigh this. He's a decent man, she said finally. Quiet about it, but decent. He's been through some hard things. She paused and then added, with the careful tone of someone choosing words that are adjacent to a larger thing they've decided not to say, most people in this town have decided what they think about him. You might hear things. Eveline looked at her steadily. What kind of things? The kind that come from people who need a story to make sense of something that doesn't. Paulette met her gaze without flinching. His wife left. People around here don't always know what to do with that. A man whose wife dies is a tragedy. A man whose wife leaves is a question nobody wants to answer, because the answer might be uncomfortable. Eveline said nothing for a moment. Then she said, How long ago? 4 years, near enough. She bought what she needed at the store and walked back through the afternoon heat and thought about what Paulette had told her, not the content of it, which she was still sorting through, but the way she had told it, the careful choosing, the decision about what to say and what not to say, the respect embedded in the choice to say something rather than nothing. There were people in every town who held a place together like stitching, and Paulette was one of them. Eveline recognized the type because she had tried, for years in her previous life, to be one herself. She was halfway back to the ranch when she heard the hoofbeats on the road behind her, and then Jasper pulled up beside her on the bay horse and looked down at her with an expression that was not quite concern and not quite annoyance and not quite anything else she could name. You walked, he said. It appeared to be the most reasonable option. He considered this. Then he said nothing and dismounted and walked beside her, leading the horse, without being asked and without making a ceremony of it. They walked in silence for a time. The road was still soft from the rain, and the grass on either side of it was very green, greener than it had seemed before, and the hills in the distance had that particular quality they got after rain, as though someone had brought them closer overnight. I spoke to a woman in town, Eveline said. Paulette. From the dry goods store, he said. She mentioned your wife. She felt rather than saw the slight shift in his posture, the small internal steadying that a person does when they were expecting something, and it arrives anyway. He said nothing. She said people have opinions about what happened, Eveline said. She didn't seem to share them. Paulette's a fair woman, Jasper said. Are there things I should know? For practical purposes. She kept her voice even, the voice she used when she wanted to ask something true without making it bigger than it needed to be. About the ranch, about what I'm walking into. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, Corinne left of her own choice. That's the whole of it. People here needed it to be something else, and since I didn't give them another version, they made one up. Do you care what version they made? He looked at the road ahead. I used to, he said. Less so now. She let the silence settle back between them and did not push further. She had gotten what she needed, which was not information but calibration, understanding how he held difficult things, whether he carried them outward or inward, whether they showed in his voice or only in his stillness. Inward, she decided. He carried things inward, where they took up space without making noise. She understood that way of carrying things because she had used it herself for years. That evening after dinner, when Jasper had gone to check the animals for the night, Eveline went to the pantry shelf and took down the account books again. This time, she went through them with purpose, with the full focus of someone who has decided to understand rather than simply observe. She turned each page and read each column and built in her mind the picture of a ranch over 4 years, the slow, careful management of it, the decisions made and not made, the places where money had been spent and the places where it had been held back. She was not looking for wrongdoing. She was looking for pattern. She found it. In the second year of the books, the surplus had been larger than in the first. In the third year, slightly smaller. In the fourth, smaller again. Not by much, not by amounts that would alarm a casual reader. But the trajectory was consistent. Not a failing ranch. A maintained ranch. A ranch being kept at the minimum level of viability by a man who was not investing in its future because he had already decided there would not be one. He was not managing the ranch for profit. He was managing it for long enough. Long enough for what? She was still working out. But the shape of it was becoming clearer. She sat at the kitchen table with the account books open and thought about a man who oiled the lock on a door for a woman he intended to use as a signature, who hung new curtains in a room that would only be occupied briefly, who set a dried flower in a tin cup with deliberate care for a guest who would be gone by spring. And she thought, what kind of man prepares a space so carefully for a person he does not intend to keep? She did not sleep for a long time that night. What woke her eventually was not sound, but the absence of it. The sudden quality of a house that has gone fully still. She lay in the dark and understood, without knowing how, that the footsteps below had stopped. That Jasper had stood in his place in the front room and then returned to his bed. She thought about what Paulette had said. A man whose wife leaves is a question, and she thought, the question is not what he did to make her go. The question is what he learned from it. In the morning, she came downstairs and found that the hot water was on the stove again, and that beside the pot was a small piece of folded paper. She opened it. It was a hand-drawn diagram, simple and careful. Lines indicating wind direction, arrows marking the relationship between cloud formation and the quality of morning light. Each notation was neat and minimal, written by someone who did not waste words, even when writing, even when no one was watching. It was the map of something she had asked to understand. She stood in the kitchen with the diagram in her hands and felt the particular pressure of something she had not prepared herself for, the evidence of a man who listens. She folded the paper carefully and put it in the pocket of her dress. She did not take it out again that day, but she was aware of it there, the small weight of it against her hip. The way you are always aware of the things you've decided to keep. She went out to the garden after breakfast and worked until her hands knew the soil. When she came back for the midday meal, Jasper was sitting on the porch, and he looked up when she came through the gate, and she saw something in his face she had not seen before. Not warmth exactly, but the direction of it, the turn of a thing that had been facing away and was beginning, very slowly, to face toward. She sat down on the step below the porch and pulled off the work gloves and looked at her hands, which were clean because she had rinsed them at the well, but still carried the faint darkness of the earth at the creases of her knuckles. I found something in the account books, she said, not as an accusation, as the opening of a conversation. He looked at her. The ranch isn't failing, she said. It's been managed down. deliberately. He was quiet for a moment. Is that a question? It's an observation, she said. I'm wondering if you want to tell me what it means. He looked out at the yard, at the fence line and the barn and the crates stacked in the shadow of the barn wall. The late morning light came flat and warm across everything, making the shapes of things very clear. It means, he said finally, that I made a decision a while back about how this was going to end, and I've been working toward it. Selling. Leaving, he said, as though that were a different thing, as though the distinction mattered to him. She looked at the crates. She looked at the freshly painted fence that was also somehow new fence, new posts, new planks, work done to preserve something that was going to be someone else's problem before long. You keep fixing things, she said. If you're leaving. He turned to look at her, and there was something in his expression then that she did not have a name for yet. Something at the intersection of surprise and recognition. The look of a man who has said something without knowing he was saying it, and been understood. I suppose I do, he said. The silence that came after was different from the silences before it. It had a quality of consideration, of two people arriving at the same door from different directions and both pausing with their hands on the handle. Eveline looked at the work gloves in her lap. She thought about the diagram in her pocket. She thought about the account books and the garden and the lock on the door and all the small evidence of a man who cared about things even when he had decided not to keep them. And she thought about herself, standing at her own door for 3 years, hand on the handle, never quite going through. She put the gloves back on. The garden bed I've been clearing, she said, has good soil. Whoever planted it knew what they were doing. Jasper looked at her for a moment. She did, he said. Simple as that. Not an opening, not a closing. Just a fact, offered plainly, without apology or performance, the way you offer something you are no longer trying to hide. Eveline nodded. She stood and went back through the gate. She worked until the light changed, and when she finally stopped and turned, the porch was empty, and the lamps were lit inside, and the smell of supper was coming through the open kitchen window. She stood at the gate of that half-wild garden and looked at the small portion of it she had brought back to order. The dark-turned soil, the cleared edges, the suggestion of a shape that had been there all along, waiting under the overgrowth for someone to recognize it. She took the diagram from her pocket and unfolded it. She looked at the arrows and the notations and the careful lines in handwriting that did not waste itself. The evening sky to the west was deep and clear and held that particular quality he had described, the tomorrow quality, the color of a world that intended to continue. She folded the paper again and put it back. She went inside for supper. The box was in the storeroom. Eveline found it on a morning when she had gone looking for a spare hinge to fix the garden gate latch, working her way through the organized disorder of a space that held everything a working ranch accumulated over years. Coiled rope and rusted tools and the clean smell of oil and old leather. The box itself was not hidden. It sat on a shelf between a tin of axle grease and a coil of baling wire, as though it had been placed there and then simply left, the way you leave something when you are not ready to deal with it but cannot bring yourself to put it somewhere you cannot see it. It was a plain wooden box, the kind used for correspondence, and it was full of letters. She did not open any of them. She looked at them for a moment. The neat stack, the careful order that suggested someone had arranged them after they arrived rather than leaving them in the disorder of receipt. And she understood two things simultaneously. The first was that these letters were from Corinne. The second was that none of them had been opened. The envelopes were intact, every one of them. She put the box back between the axle grease and the baling wire, exactly as she had found it, and she found the hinge she had come for, and she went back to the garden and fixed the latch, and she did not say anything about the box for the rest of that day, but she thought about it. She thought about a man who had received letters from his wife, or his former wife, or the woman who had been his wife, and was now something for which there was no clean word, and who had arranged those letters in careful order and then not opened a single one of them. She thought about what that required. Not indifference, because indifference does not arrange things carefully. Something more complicated than indifference, something that lived at the intersection of wanting and not allowing yourself to want, of caring and deciding that caring was no longer something you were permitted to do. She knew that intersection. She had lived at it for years. That evening, after the dishes were done and the kitchen had settled into its nighttime quiet, she sat across from Jasper at the table with her warp thread in her hands, and she said, without looking up, "There are letters in the storeroom." He did not move. She could feel the quality of his stillness change, the way a room changes when the pressure in it shifts. "I know," he said, "from Corinne." "Yes." She wound the thread around her fingers, over and under, the motion automatic and self-contained. "You've kept them in order." "I have." "But you haven't opened them." The silence that followed was long enough to have a shape. She waited in it without filling it, which was the only way to wait for something true. "No," he said finally. She looked up then. He was looking at the table, at the grain of the wood, with the particular focus of someone who is not actually seeing what they are looking at. "Why not?" she asked, and she kept her voice the way she kept her hands when she was working a difficult section of pattern, steady and without urgency, because urgency tightens everything. He was quiet for another moment. "Because I don't know which is worse," he said. "That she explains herself and I understand it, or that she explains herself and I still don't." She held that. She turned it over the way she turned a length of thread to check for weak spots. "There's a third option," she said. He looked at her. "That she explains herself and you realize you already knew. And the knowing doesn't change anything, but you have to live with having it in words instead of just in the feeling of it." He looked at her for a long time. The lamp between them threw the light upward and sideways, and in that light his face had the quality of something very old and very patient, the quality of landscape that has decided to simply be what it is. "You speak like someone who has carried things for a while," he said. "I have," she said. It was the most direct thing she had said to him in all the days since she arrived, and she felt the openness of it, the slight vulnerability of a seam that has been let out, revealing more than was there before. She looked back at her thread. "My husband was a good man," she said. "He was generous and he was gentle, and he never once said a harsh word to me in 9 years. She paused. "And I sat at his bedside the night he died, and I held his hand, and I waited for something to move in my chest, some large feeling that would tell me what we had been to each other. And what I felt was quiet, not the quiet of peace, the quiet of a room where the conversation stopped so long ago, you can't remember what it was about." Jasper did not say anything, but she felt him listening in the way that some people listen, not waiting for a pause to fill, but actually receiving what was being said. taking it in and giving it space. When it was over, she said, I couldn't cry, and I thought for a long time that meant something was wrong with me, that I was cold or broken, or that I had never really loved him. She stopped winding the thread. But I think now it meant something different. I think it meant I had already grieved him while he was still alive, for the distance between us that kept growing no matter how still I stood. And by the time he was actually gone, there was nothing left to grieve. It had all already happened. She set the thread down. The silence in that house after he died, she said, was the same as the silence while he was in it. And that was the saddest thing I had ever known. The lamp flickered. Outside, something moved in the grass, a night animal passing through on its own business, unbothered by the weight of what was happening inside the lit window. Jasper looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at her. Corinne left, he said, because she said I never let her see that she mattered. He said it plainly, without defense or apology. The way you state a fact that has been examined so many times, it has lost its capacity to surprise you, even if it hasn't lost its capacity to hurt. I didn't know how to show that. I thought doing was the same as showing. I thought if I kept the roof sound and the cattle fed and the fence line straight, she would feel it, that she would understand that all of it was for her. He stopped. She didn't, he said. Evelyn looked at him. Did you know she didn't? I knew something was wrong, he said. I didn't know what it was, and I didn't ask because I was afraid of what asking would open. So I just kept doing. I kept fixing things. I kept the fence line straight. He looked at his hands. And one morning, she was gone. The fire in the stove settled with a sound like a slow breath. The night outside the window was very dark and very full of the sound of grass. The letters came after, he said. I don't know what she wrote. I don't know if she was angry or sad or relieved or all of those things at once. I put them in order because it felt wrong to leave them in disorder. And then I didn't open them because I had already built a wall around what happened. And I was afraid that opening one of those letters would be like pulling a stone from the base of it. And if the wall came down? Evelyn asked. He looked at her. Then I'd have to decide what to build in its place. She held his gaze and did not look away. That's not the worst thing, she said quietly. He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she became aware of the distance across the table as something with texture, something that could be measured. Then he said, No, I suppose it isn't. They sat in the quiet of that for a while. Not the silence of distance, the silence of two people who have said something true and are allowing it to settle before they decide what to say next. The following days had a different quality. She noticed it first in small ways, the way light changes in a room when you rearrange one piece of furniture, not dramatic, but perceptible. An altered relationship between things that have always been there. Jasper still spoke rarely, but when he did speak, he said things that were closer to what he actually meant, and she found herself doing the same in return, the two of them calibrating toward a kind of directness that was new to them both, and required effort in the way that new things require effort before they become habit. She began to accompany him on some of the morning rounds, not because he asked, but because she started appearing at the barn door at the time he left, and he did not tell her not to, which she understood as permission. They moved through the morning together in a companionable quiet, checking the water troughs and the fence line and the condition of the cattle in the south pasture. And she learned the ranch through her feet and her hands, the way she had always learned things, by direct contact, by touch. On one of those mornings, they were checking the fence along the western boundary when she noticed that the posts on the far end were older, their wood weathered to a silver gray that contrasted with the newer posts closer to the house. She ran her hand along one of the older posts and felt the texture of it, the roughness of long exposure. "This section was here before the rest," she said. He looked at the post. "That was the original fence," he said, "from before I bought the property. Everything from here to the creek is mine. Everything from the creek west is what was already standing." She looked along the line of old fence, disappearing into the grass. "You kept it." "It was still sound," he said. "No reason to replace something that's still doing its work." She looked at him. He was looking at the fence with a particular expression, thoughtful and specific, and she thought, this is how he thinks about things, in terms of function and duration, in terms of what is still doing its work. She thought about the letters in the box. She thought about herself, standing at a gate she had already decided to stop going through. That afternoon, she was on the porch winding thread when the rider came up the main track. She saw him before Jasper did, because Jasper was in the barn, and she watched the rider come with the attention she gave to things she had not yet categorized. He was a broad man on a gray horse, and he rode with the ease of someone comfortable in the saddle, and he looked at the house and the yard with the assessing gaze of someone who has an interest in what he is looking at. Jasper came out of the barn at the sound of the hoofbeats and stood in the yard with his thumbs in his belt, and the two men looked at each other across the distance with the particular quality of two people who know each other well enough to know that pleasantries are going to be difficult. "Bryce," Jasper said. "Jasper." The man swung down from the horse with the practiced ease of someone who has done it thousands of times. He had a broad, weather-roughened face and eyes that were the color of winter sky, pale and without much warmth in them. He took off his hat and held it, which was a courtesy, and he looked at Eveline on the porch with a gaze that measured and calculated in a single pass. "This is the woman, then," Bryce said. "This is Eveline Marsh," Jasper said. Bryce nodded at her. She nodded back. She kept her hands on the thread and did not stand up, because she had learned long ago that the decision to stand or remain seated carried information, and she was not yet ready to give him all the information she had. "I heard you were moving forward with the sale," Bryce said, turning back to Jasper. "I'm in discussions," Jasper said, "with the Dellinger Group." A pause. "Among others." Bryce turned his hat in his hands, a slow rotation, thinking or performing thinking. Eveline was not sure which. "I need to talk to you about Corinne's interest in the property," he said. "Her legal interest. She's entitled to her portion if the sale goes through." The quality of the air in the yard changed. Eveline felt it from the porch, a tightening, the way the air changes before weather. "Corinne left," Jasper said. His voice was even. "She left the marriage," Bryce said. "She didn't leave her legal claim to property acquired jointly during it." He looked at Jasper with the flat, patient look of someone who is prepared for this conversation. "She's entitled to a portion of the sale proceeds. I've been authorized to negotiate on her behalf." Jasper stood very still. "When did she authorize you?" "Recently." Bryce put his hat back on. "She's been following things from a distance." When she heard you were selling, she asked me to come." He paused. "She has no bad intentions toward you, Jasper. She just wants what's hers." The silence that followed had a different texture from any silence Eveline had heard in that yard before. It was the silence of something arriving that had always been coming, and the exhaustion that came with finally seeing it appear on the horizon. "I'll need to think about it," Jasper said. "That's all I'm asking," Bryce said. He looked at Eveline again, briefly, and there was something in that look she noted carefully, an assessment of her position, her relationship to the thing being negotiated, a calculation of what she knew and what she represented. Then he mounted and rode back down the track without being invited to stay for coffee, which told her he had not expected to be invited. She watched him go. Then she looked at Jasper, who was still standing in the yard with his thumbs in his belt, and she saw something she had not seen before in all the days she had been there. His shoulders had dropped, just slightly, with a weight that was not quite defeat, and not quite acceptance, and not quite anything she had a single word for. He looked like a man who had been holding up something for a very long time, and had just heard that there was more of it still to come. She set her thread down and came off the porch. She did not say anything. She came and stood beside him in the yard and looked at the place where the rider had disappeared down the track, and she let the silence be what it needed to be, which was not empty, but full of all the complicated things that happen when the past arrives on horseback in the middle of an afternoon. After a time, Jasper said, "Corinne's brother." "I gathered," she said. "She has a legal claim," he said. "He's right about that." "I know," she said. She had understood it as soon as Bryce began speaking. The account books had told her the property had been jointly held. The names on the early entries had told her that Corinne Holt alongside Jasper Holt, and a jointly held property carried obligations that did not dissolve with the departure of one party. She looked at the barn. She looked at the fence line. She looked at the garden gate and the dark turned soil visible through the slats, and the suggestion of order being recovered from wildness. She looked at the man beside her, who was looking at none of these things, who was looking at the middle distance with the eyes of someone doing arithmetic that was not about numbers. "Jasper," she said. He looked at her. "I found the letters," she said. "In the storeroom. I wasn't looking for them. I want you to know that." He held her gaze. "You should open them," she said. Not gently, not harshly, simply as a thing she believed was true. "Not for her sake, for yours. You need to know what she said before you can decide what any of this means." He looked at her for a long time. The afternoon light had moved while they were standing there, the way afternoon light does, shifting its angle, changing the quality of what it fell on. It fell on him now from a lower angle and made the lines of his face more distinct, the evidence of years in weather and work and the particular fatigue of a person who has been managing something alone for too long. "What if what she says changes what I think happened?" he asked. "Then what you think happened needed to be changed," Eveline said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded once, the small decisive nod she had come to recognize as the way he agreed to things he knew he needed to do, but had been avoiding. He turned and walked toward the storeroom. She stood in the yard and looked at the garden gate and the dark soil and the evening light coming down over the western hills. And she thought about the thread she had wound that morning and the pattern she had been working out. The way a pattern requires both the forward thread and the returning thread. the way neither one alone makes cloth. She thought about what it meant to open a letter you had been afraid to open. She thought about what it meant to stay in a yard in the day's last light while someone else did that. After a time, she went in and built up the stove and put the kettle on, because she thought he would want something warm when he came back, and because it was the only useful thing she knew to do. She was still at the stove when she heard him come back into the kitchen. She did not turn around immediately. She gave him the moment that belonged to him, the moment of returning from a difficult place, which required a certain amount of privacy, even when you were not alone. She heard him sit down at the table. She heard the letter, she thought only one, being set down on the wood. Then she poured the tea and brought it to the table and sat across from him. His face was the face of someone who has received news they already knew and found that it was worse in words than it had been in feeling, and also somehow more endurable, because words have edges, and things with edges can eventually be put down. He did not tell her what the letter said. She did not ask. She poured her own cup and wrapped her hands around it and sat with him in the lamplight. And outside the dark had come fully down, and the stars were beginning, and the house was very quiet around them both. After a long time, he said, "She said she left because she never once believed that she was the reason I did anything. She believed she was the beneficiary of a man who would have worked this hard and cared this much regardless of whether she was here." He stopped. She said she felt like a witness to a life that would have been exactly the same without her. Evelyn held her cup. Was she right? She asked. The question took courage to ask, and she knew it, and she asked it anyway, because she had been in a life where the real questions did not get asked, and she knew what that cost. Jasper looked at the letter on the table. He looked at it for a very long time. "I don't know," he said finally. "I think I worked this hard because of her, because I wanted to give her something solid, something that would last." He paused. "But I never told her that. And maybe if you never tell someone something, it's the same as if it weren't true." Evelyn looked at her tea. She thought about thread. She thought about the way a pattern has to be read from the back as well as the front, the way the underside of a woven thing shows all the work that the surface conceals. "Or," she said quietly, "it means you both needed to learn a language the other one spoke." He looked at her. "She needed to hear it," Evelyn said, "and you needed to learn to say it. And neither of you knew that was the problem, so neither of you solved it." She set her cup down. "That's not a failure of love. That's a failure of translation." He sat very still for a long moment. Then he said, "Where did you learn to think about things like that?" She looked at him, and she felt something in her face that was not quite a smile and not quite sorrow, but lived in the territory between them. "From weaving," she said, "and from a long time of getting things wrong." He looked at her across the table, in the lamplight, in the quiet house, and she felt the quality of that look in a way she had not felt a look in a very long time. Not assessment, not calculation, something more careful than either of those things. The look of someone who is seeing you, not the useful version of you or the version that serves a purpose, but the actual shape of you, the real dimensions. She did not look away. Outside, the wind moved through the grass, and the stars were very bright, and the night had the quality of a thing that intends to last until morning, patient and enormous, and full of the particular silence of the open country, which is not empty silence, but the silence of something too large to make noise, simply present, simply there, the way the best things always are. Bryce came back on a Tuesday. He came alone this time, without the performance of the first visit. No slow approach on the track, no theatrical pause before dismounting. He tied his horse at the post by the gate and knocked on the door of the house while Jasper was out in the far pasture, which Eveline suspected was not an accident. She opened the door and looked at him. He had the decency not to pretend the timing was coincidental. He took off his hat, which was the same courtesy he had extended before, and he looked at her with those pale, assessing eyes, and he said, "I'd like to talk to you, if you're willing." She considered the door between them. Then she stepped back and let him in. She put the kettle on because it gave her something to do with her hands while she thought, and because offering tea to a man who had come to negotiate was not hospitality, but information gathering. The way a person behaves around a cup of tea that has been offered tells you something about what they want from the encounter. Bryce sat at the table and placed his hat in front of him and looked around the kitchen with the same calculating attention he had given the yard on his first visit. She could see him reading the room the way she read things, cataloging, assessing, building a picture from details. She set the cups on the table and sat across from him and waited. "You've made yourself at home," he said. It was not quite a compliment and not quite an accusation. "I've made myself useful," she said. "Those are different things." He looked at her with a slight recalibration. The expression of someone who has made an assumption and discovered it requires adjustment. "Fair enough," he said. He turned the cup in its saucer. "I'll be direct with you, Mrs. Marsh." "I'd prefer that," she said. "Corinne's claim to this property is legitimate. I want you to understand that before anything else. This is not a scheme or an attempt to take something that doesn't belong to her. The law is simply the law. And the law says that a woman who held joint title to a property retains her interest in it regardless of the circumstances that ended the marriage." "I understand that," Eveline said. He looked at her steadily. "What you may not understand is the specific mechanism Jasper has been using to proceed with the sale." He paused, letting the weight of what he was about to say arrange itself. "The documents he asked you to sign when you first arrived. The co-ownership transfer papers." She said nothing. She kept her hands around her cup, and her face still. "If you sign those papers," Bryce said, "you become the legal co-owner of record, and the sale proceeds as a transfer from two current owners, which supersedes Corinne's prior claim. Her interest effectively disappears into the transaction." He looked at her. "She gets nothing, and Jasper walks away clean." The kitchen was very quiet. The kettle had stopped its sound, and the fire in the stove was low, and the only thing moving was the light coming through the window, shifting slightly as a cloud passed somewhere above. Eveline looked at the cup in her hands. She thought about the morning Jasper had put the papers on the table. She thought about his voice saying that's the plan with the flatness of a man stating something settled. She thought about how she had held the pen above the signature line and felt something in her hand refuse to complete the motion, and how she had told herself it was instinct without knowing what the instinct was responding to. Now she knew. "You're telling me this because you want me to refuse to sign," she said. "I'm telling you this," Bryce said carefully, "because you deserve to make an informed choice about what you're participating in." She looked at him. and because it protects Corinne's claim. He met her gaze. Yes, he said. That too. She set her cup down. She looked at the table surface, the grain of the wood she had come to know in the weeks she had been sitting at it, the particular pattern of it, the way it ran and where it knotted and where it ran clear. She thought about what Jasper had said on the porch, that first conversation about the papers. He had not lied to her, not precisely. He had told her the ranch was being sold and that her signature was needed. He had not explained the mechanism. He had not explained what her signature would do to someone else's claim. She thought about the letters in the storeroom, arranged in careful order by a man who could not bring himself to open them. She thought about a woman who had written letter after letter from a distance, maintaining a legal interest in a place she had chosen to leave, which was its own complicated statement about what she hoped might still be possible. She thought about Jasper at the table the night he had finally opened one of those letters, the look on his face that was worse and also more endurable at the same time. She thought about the hot water on the stove every morning, the diagram of wind direction on a folded piece of paper in her pocket, the work gloves in exactly her size. How much is Corinne's portion? She asked. Bryce told her. It was a fair number, neither punitive nor generous, simply a proportional calculation of what the ranch was worth and what half of that represented. It was also, she noted without reacting, almost precisely the surplus she had identified in the account books, the amount that had accumulated over 4 years of careful management. She stood up. She went to the pantry shelf and brought the account books back to the table and opened them to the page she had been studying the night everything had begun to clarify. She turned the book so Bryce could see it. She pointed to a column without speaking. He leaned forward and read. She watched his face, which was a face that had learned to reveal very little, but which showed in that moment a small and genuine surprise. He's been building toward it, Bryce said slowly. Over 4 years, she said, quietly, without touching the principal value of the property. Everything goes in, nothing comes out. She looked at the column. He's been accumulating her portion without knowing how to give it to her. The kitchen was very quiet again. Bryce sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way a person looks at the ceiling when they are revising a story they thought they understood. Then he looked at her. He never contacted her, he said. Not once in 4 years. No, she said. I don't think he knew how. She closed the account book. That doesn't excuse the papers he put in front of me. He should have explained what he was doing, but I don't think the thing he was doing was what it looked like. Bryce was quiet for a moment. What do you think it was? She looked at the window. Outside, the grass moved in the afternoon wind, the long, slow movement of it, patient and continuous. I think it was a man who could not find the language to say what he meant, so he said it in the only language he had, in numbers and maintenance and things set aside and kept in order. She paused. The same way he says everything. Bryce looked at her for a long time. There was something in his expression she had not seen there before, something that was not quite respect and not quite surprise, but occupied the space between them. You've worked him out, he said. Some of him, she said. Enough. He stood and picked up his hat. He did not put it on immediately. He held it and looked at her, and she could see him making a decision. Corinne doesn't want to take something from him, he said. She wants to know that she wasn't nothing, that her time here meant something. That's what the legal claim is actually about. He turned the hat. If there were another way to tell her that. Something she could hold on to. Eveline looked at the account books on the table. She said, "Give me a few days." Bryce nodded, put on his hat, and left. She sat alone at the table for a long time after the sound of his horse had faded. She sat in the particular silence of a room where a significant thing has just happened and has not yet been spoken to anyone else, where the information sits unshared and therefore still entirely yours, before the weight of it is distributed by telling. She was still sitting there when she heard the wagon coming back up the track. She did not move. She heard Jasper unhitch the horse and put it in the barn and do the things he always did in that order without variation. And then she heard his boots on the porch and the door opening, and she heard him stop when he saw her at the table. She did not look up immediately. She gave herself the moment she needed to decide how to say what she was going to say, not the words exactly, but the quality of it, the tone, the place to begin. Then she looked up. He read her face before she said anything. She saw him read it, the slight change in his posture, the particular stillness that settled over him when he understood that something had shifted. He came and sat down across from her. She told him, not with anger, because what she felt was not precisely anger. And she had long ago learned to be specific about what she felt, rather than reaching for the nearest large emotion. She told him what Bryce had explained about the mechanism of the documents, and what she had read in the account books, and what she had said to Bryce about what she believed Jasper had actually been doing with those 4 years of surplus. He listened without interrupting. He looked at the table while she spoke, not to avoid her eyes, but in the way he looked at things when he was receiving them fully, giving them his complete attention. When she finished, the silence lasted long enough to have substance. "I should have explained the documents," he said. "Yes," she said. "You should have." "I didn't explain them because I didn't want to have the conversation that explaining them would require." "I know," she said. "That's the problem." He looked up. "You're angry." "I'm clear," she said. "There's a difference." She held his gaze. "I'm not angry that you had a complicated situation. I'm not angry that you needed a way out of it. I'm telling you that I cannot be a mechanism in someone else's story without knowing that's what I am." She paused. "I came here to start something, not to be used to end something. And those are not the same journey." He looked at her for a long time. In the flat afternoon light through the kitchen window, his face had the quality it sometimes had in the early morning, before the day had required anything of him yet, open and unguarded in a way that he did not seem to know was visible. "You're right," he said. It was simply said, without qualification or deflection, and she recognized how much it cost a man like him to say it, a man for whom being right was not a performance, but a standard he held himself to, and so being wrong was not an argument lost, but a genuine reckoning. "The surplus in the books," she said, more quietly now. "Is that what I think it is?" He looked at the account books on the table. His jaw worked slightly, the small motion of a person choosing words. "I didn't know how to send it to her," he said. "I didn't know if she wanted it or what she would think it meant, or whether sending money was an insult or an acknowledgement or something else entirely. So I kept it separate, kept it clean, in case there was ever a moment when I knew how to do it right." Eveline looked at the man across the table, at the 4 years of careful arithmetic, at the letters opened once and the rest unopened, at the fence lines kept straight and the barn roof sound and the garden left wild and the lock on her door oiled to a smooth and silent turn. "Jasper," she said, "the moment is now." His eyes came to hers. "Not sending the money," she said. "I mean something else." She thought about what Bryce had told her, about what Corinne actually wanted, the thing underneath the legal claim, the human need wearing the costume of a legal proceeding. She wants to know she wasn't nothing. That's what her brother said. The claim is not about the money. It's about being seen. She paused. Write to her. Not about the ranch and not about the sale. Tell her you've been keeping her portion separate for 4 years because you didn't know how to give it to her properly, and that you're sorry you never found the words to say what you meant while she was still here to hear them. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, something that was new on his face, the way new growth is new, unmistakable and a little startling. "That's it," he said. "That's everything," she said. "For her." She held his gaze. "There are other things still to sort out. Between us. About those papers and what you intended, and what I'm willing to be part of." She looked at the table. "But those things can wait one more day." He nodded. Then he stood and went to the shelf where he kept the writing paper and ink, things she had never seen him use in all her time in the house, and he brought them to the table and sat back down. He looked at the blank page for a moment, and she could see the difficulty of it, the blankness of a page that requires you to begin. She stood up. She took her warp thread from the windowsill and went to the chair by the stove and sat down and began to work, giving him the privacy of the table and the lamp and the blank page, present enough that he was not alone in it, and distant enough that it was still his. She heard the scratch of the pen begin. She worked the thread through her fingers and listened to the sound of a man writing a letter he should have written 4 years ago, and she thought about all the letters in the world that went unwritten, all the things unsaid between people who could not find the language, all the silences that grew in the spaces where words should have been and hardened into walls so gradually that no one could say exactly when the wall had become load-bearing. She thought about her own silences, the 9 years of them. She thought about the question she had not yet answered, the one Jasper had asked at the garden gate, the one she had told him to ask again when he was not standing at the threshold. She thought about what her answer was, or what it was becoming, the way an answer sometimes becomes itself gradually, like a pattern that only makes sense once you have woven enough of it to see the whole. She was still thinking about it when he set the pen down. She looked up. He was folding the letter with the same deliberate care he gave to everything, the careful, precise fold of someone who understands that how you do a thing reflects what you think the thing is worth. He looked at her across the room. "I need to ask you something," he said. She set her thread down. "The papers," he said. "I know I should have explained them. I know what I was doing was wrong, even if what I meant by it was something else." He looked at the folded letter in his hands. "But I need to know whether what I've told you since then, whether any of it has been enough to change what you think of why you're here." She looked at him for a long time. The stove breathed beside her. Outside the window the evening had come fully down, and the first stars were visible above the western hills, clear and precise. She thought about what it meant to come to a place to disappear and find instead that you were being seen. She thought about a man who fixes things he is planning to leave. She thought about the garden, the dark turned soil, the suggestion of a shape that had been there all along. "Ask me what you actually want to ask," she said quietly. He looked at her. Stay, he said. One word, plain and unornamented, the most direct thing he had ever said to her, offered without negotiation or explanation, just the word itself, standing in the room asking for an answer. She felt it move through her the way a current moves through water, not on the surface, but underneath, where the real movement is. She looked at the folded letter in his hands. She looked at his face, at the lines of it, at the years of weather and work and solitude, at the quality of a man who had built his life around doing rather than saying, and was now, for the first time in a very long time, trying to say. She said, "Ask me again when the garden comes in." He looked at her, and she saw something move in his face. Not disappointment, not quite. Something more patient than that. Something that understood the shape of what she meant, which was not no, and was not yes, but was something truer than either of those, which was, the answer is still becoming itself. Give it the time that takes. He nodded. He stood and put on his coat and took the letter and went out into the evening to the storeroom where he kept the things that needed sending, and she heard the door close behind him, and she sat for a moment in the quiet of the kitchen, alone with the breathing stove and the folded thread and the window full of stars. Then she stood and began to put supper on. Her hands moved through the familiar motions, the work of feeding, of warmth, of continuation, and she thought, this is also a language, the language of doing in the place of saying, of hot water on the back burner and sharpened knives and meals set on the table without ceremony. She was learning to speak it. She was also, she thought, beginning to teach another one in return. Outside, the wind moved through the grass in the long, slow rhythm of the open country, patient and without urgency, the sound of a place that had been here before anyone arrived and would remain long after, that held the histories of everyone who had passed through it with equal impartiality, neither judging nor endorsing, simply continuing. She put the biscuits in the oven and stood at the window and looked at the dark garden, the suggestion of order within it, the dark-turned soil waiting for what came next. She had been in the space between things for most of her life, waiting for the next thing to begin, moving through the narrow place between what was and what would be without ever stopping long enough to ask whether the space itself might be somewhere worth standing. She was standing in it now. And for the first time, she did not feel the urgency to move through it. She felt instead the quiet possibility of remaining. 3 weeks passed the way good things sometimes pass, not quickly and not slowly, but with the particular fullness of time that is being used rather than endured. Bryce came back on a morning that smelled of coming warmth, the first genuinely soft morning after the long, cold stretch, and he came with a different quality of arrival than he had brought before. He tied his horse with less tension in the movement. He knocked with less purpose. When Eveline opened the door, he looked at her and said, without preamble, she wrote back. She stepped aside to let him in. Jasper was at the table with coffee, and he looked at Bryce the way he looked at weather he was not certain about, with patient attention and no visible reaction. Bryce sat down and put an envelope on the table, and it was a different kind of envelope from the ones in the storeroom, thinner, single-sheeted, the letter of someone who had said what needed saying, and nothing more. Jasper looked at it for a moment. Then he picked it up. He read it with the same focus he gave everything, unhurried and complete, and Eveline did not watch his face while he read, because that was not a moment that belonged to her. She kept her eyes on the window and the yard outside, and the garden gate where the first small points of green had appeared at the base of the cleared beds over the past several days, cautious and specific, the beginning of something deciding to try. When he set the letter down, she looked at him. His face was the face of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time, and has just been told they are allowed to set it down. Not the face of relief exactly, because relief requires tension to release, and what she saw in him was something beneath tension, something structural, a weight that had been load-bearing for so long it had begun to feel like the architecture itself. She said, "It's enough," he said. His voice was even, but only with effort. Evelyn looked at the letter on the table. She did not ask what else it said. She had told him that Corinne needed to know she had not been nothing, and it appeared she had been told that. Whatever else was in the letter belonged to the history between them, which was not Evelyn's to read. Bryce looked at Jasper for a moment and then looked at the table. "She's not asking for the sale to proceed," he said. "She's willing to have her portion paid out over time, as you've been building it. The arrangement Mrs. Marsh proposed." He glanced at Evelyn. "She said she thought it was a fair solution. More than fair." He paused. "She also said to tell you she's well, that she hopes you are too." Jasper nodded once, the small, decisive nod. He looked at the letter. Then he folded it carefully and set it aside and picked up his coffee cup. And the gesture was so ordinary, so precisely himself, that Evelyn felt something tighten briefly in her chest and then release. Bryce stayed for coffee. He was, she discovered, a different man without the purpose of negotiation driving him, quieter and more observant, someone who listened more than he spoke, and who, when he did speak, said things that were worth the words. He asked about the garden, which he had noticed from the track, and Evelyn told him what she had been clearing and what she thought might be salvageable from the original planting. He listened with genuine interest, which told her that whatever his relationship to Corinne was, it was not uncomplicated, that he had cared about his sister's time in this place and had wanted something for it other than legal resolution. When he left, he shook Jasper's hand, and he looked at Evelyn and said, "Whatever you decide, I hope it's what you actually want." It was a specific and careful thing to say, and she understood that he was telling her, in the oblique way of people who respect boundaries, that she had a choice, and that he hoped she knew it. She watched him ride down the track until the track bent and he was gone. Then she went back to the garden. The days that followed had the quality of something settling into its own shape. Jasper did not mention the sale again, and she did not ask, and the packing crates that had stood against the barn wall were moved inside the barn at some point. She was not sure exactly when, and the barn door was pulled mostly closed over them, as though they had been reassigned from imminent use to simply storage. She noticed this without remarking on it. She noticed also that Jasper had begun doing something in the evenings that he had not done before. After supper, when the clearing up was done, he would sit at the table with a piece of wood and a small knife and work at it with the same quiet focus he brought to everything, carving with a patience that was not performance, but simply the nature of a man who has never learned to rush the things that mattered. She did not ask what he was making. She sat with her thread or her mending or the account books, which she had taken to updating in the evenings as a way of maintaining the clarity she had found in them, and they occupied the same table in the same lamplight, with the comfortable absence of requirement that had become the texture of their evenings. On the fourth night of this, she looked up and saw that the piece of wood had become recognizable. It was a small bench, perfectly proportioned, 4 legs exactly even. The seat curved slightly to the shape of a person sitting. It was perhaps 8 inches long, a miniature of something. She looked at it and then looked at him. He did not look up immediately. He continued working a detail at the corner of the seat with a small knife, unhurried. Then he set it down on the table between them. "The bench in the garden has a short leg," he said. "I know," she said. "I keep meaning to fix it." He looked at the small carved piece between them. "I thought if I worked out the proportions first, so I know what I'm fixing toward." She looked at the small bench. She looked at the care in it, the exactness of the legs, the slight curve of the seat that was not structurally necessary but was there anyway because someone had thought about how it would feel to sit in it. She picked it up. It was lighter than she expected, the wood still fragrant with cutting, warm from his hands. She turned it over and looked at the underside, where the joints were clean and precisely fitted. "It's good work," she said. "The real one won't be as small," he said. "I know," she said. She set it back on the table between them. She looked at it for a moment. "Jasper." He looked at her. "I've been thinking about what you asked," she said. "At the garden gate." He was still. Not the stillness of bracing, but the stillness of complete attention, the quality he brought to things that mattered. "I came here to disappear," she said. She looked at the small bench on the table, and then at the window and the dark outside it. "I had spent 9 years being not quite seen by someone who was not quite there. And when he was gone, I didn't know who I was, without the shape of that, without the outline of another person defining where I ended." She paused. "So I thought if I went somewhere no one knew me, I could find out, without anyone's expectations, without anyone's idea of who I was supposed to be." She looked at him. "And then I came here," she said. "And you didn't have any idea of who I was supposed to be. You barely looked at me the first 3 days. You put hot water on the stove and left. And you didn't ask anything of me except to sign a paper I wasn't ready to sign. And then you didn't ask me why I wasn't ready." She stopped. "And I started to find out who I was. Not because you told me, because you left enough room for it to happen on its own." The fire in the stove breathed. The night outside was very still. "The answer to what you asked," she said, "is yes. But I want you to understand what yes means for me, because it doesn't mean what it might mean for someone else." She looked at her hands. "It means I'm choosing to stay. Not because I have nowhere else to go, and not because I'm afraid of what's on the other side of leaving, and not because you need a signature or I need a roof." She looked at him. "It means I'm staying because this is the first place I've been in a very long time where I could hear myself think. And I find that I like what I'm thinking." He looked at her for a long moment. The lamplight moved slightly, a draft from somewhere, and the shadows shifted and resettled. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "When I sent the advertisement," he said, "I told myself it was practical, that I needed a co-signer for the papers, and this was the most straightforward way to get one." He looked at the small bench on the table. "That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth." He was quiet for a moment. "I had been alone in this house for 4 years, and I had gotten good at it, and I thought I had made my peace with it. And then some part of me, some part I wasn't listening to very carefully, wrote an advertisement in a paper that people looking for something read. And that part knew what it was doing, even if I didn't." She looked at him. I wasn't looking for a signature, he said. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew it wasn't nothing. Outside, something moved in the grass near the garden, a small night creature on its own private business, unbothered by the weight of what was happening in the lit window. The sound of it passed and was gone. She reached across the table and set her hand over his. His hand was warm and rough with work and utterly still beneath hers, the stillness of something that has been waiting to be held and has decided not to move in case the holding stops. She left her hand there. He turned his palm up, slowly, and his fingers closed around hers with the deliberate care of a man who understands that some things, once held, change the shape of what holding is possible. They sat like that in the lamplight for a long time, not speaking, not needing to. The silence between them now the silence of two people who are in the same place at the same time, and know it, which is a different silence from any other kind. The following morning, Eveline went to the garden before breakfast. The air had the quality of genuine spring now, not the hesitant warmth of the weeks before, but something committed, something that had decided. The smell of the earth was different in the mornings now, alive in a way that it hadn't been when she first arrived, when it had been cold and closed. Now it breathed. She could smell it breathing when she pushed the gate open and stepped inside. The green points she had noticed were more numerous today. She crouched down beside the nearest bed and looked at them closely. The first true leaves, not seed leaves, but proper leaves, the plant's real face showing itself for the first time. She did not know yet what they were. She would have to wait for more growth before she could tell what this bed had been planted with, what Corinne had put here, and what the years of neglect had allowed to survive. She worked through the morning, moving slowly through the garden, clearing, turning, uncovering. She was not trying to restore it to what it had been. She was trying to understand what it was now, what had persisted and what had gone, what needed help, and what had found its own way through. These were different questions from the ones she had started with, and she recognized the difference as a kind of progress. At mid-morning, she heard the gate and looked up to see Jasper standing at the entry with 2 cups. He crossed the garden carefully, stepping between the beds with the attention of someone who has begun to understand the grammar of a space and does not want to violate it. He handed her a cup and stood beside her and looked at what she had been working on. The cleared beds, the turned soil, the small green points visible now in several places across the space. "More of them today," he said. "Yes," she said. She looked at the nearest cluster. "I think this bed might have been lavender. The leaf shape is right." "She grew lavender," he said. "Not with sadness, or not only with sadness. Something more complex than that. The quality of a memory that has been allowed to become simply a memory rather than a wound." She looked at him. He was looking at the small green points with an expression that was new on his face, or not new exactly, but newly visible, as though something that had always been there had been given permission to show. "You could have kept the sale going," she said. "Even without my signature, there were other arrangements possible. Bryce said so." "I know," he said. "Why didn't you?" He looked at the garden. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was being precise rather than evasive. "Because somewhere between the first morning and now," he said, "the thing I was planning to walk away from became the thing I wanted to keep." He paused. "And I think I knew that before I was ready to say it." She looked at the cup in her hands. "The fence along the western boundary," she said. "The new posts." He looked at her. "You were fixing it," she said, "when you thought you were leaving. You kept fixing things." She looked at him steadily. "I think you knew for longer than you're admitting." Something moved in his face, something that in another man might have become a smile, and in him became a particular quality of stillness, warm and specific, directed entirely at her. "Possibly," he said. She shook her head slightly, not with frustration, but with the affectionate exasperation of someone who recognizes a familiar pattern in another person and finds it both aggravating and endearing. She looked back at the garden. "The bench needs fixing," she said. "Today," he said. "Good," she said. "I'd like somewhere to sit when it's warm enough." He looked at the bench against the fence, the one with the short leg, weathered and gray but still structurally sound. He looked at it with the eyes of someone who has worked out the proportions already, who has a small carved model on his kitchen table and knows exactly what he is fixing toward. "It'll hold," he said, "once the leg is right." She nodded. They stood in the garden together in the spring morning with their cups and the smell of turned earth and the small, cautious green of things that had survived the winter by going down deep and waiting for the conditions to change. Above them, the sky was the particular blue that comes after cold, clear and certain, without the haziness of summer heat or the weight of winter gray. It was the sky of a specific season, of transition made complete, of the moment after the long holding on when things begin to move again. Later that afternoon, when the sun had moved to the western side of the sky and the garden was in the long gold light that made everything look like something worth keeping, Eveline heard boots on the path and looked up to see old Fenwick coming through the gate with his hat in his hand. He was a man who moved the way old things move, with an economy that comes not from haste but from having worked out long ago which movements were necessary and which were not. He looked around the garden with the eyes of someone who had seen it before, in another time, and was taking stock of what had changed. "Came to see how you're getting on," he said, which was the kind of thing he said when he meant several things at once. "Better," she said, which was also the kind of answer that meant several things at once. He looked at the cleared beds and the new growth and the bench against the fence, which Jasper had fixed that afternoon, its 4 legs now even, its surface cleaned of the gray weather and oiled back to something closer to its original self. It sat solidly now, without the slight tilt it had carried before, and it looked like what it was, a bench built for sitting in, for looking at a garden from, for being in a place long enough to see it change. "He fixed the bench," Fenwick said. "He did," she said. Fenwick looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her, and his eyes were the eyes of someone who has lived long enough to know what things mean without needing them explained. "Good," he said. He put his hat back on. "Garden looks different." "It's the same garden," she said. "Just cleared." He shook his head slightly. "It's not the same garden," he said. "A garden is what happens to the ground after someone decides to care about it. You change the caring, you change the garden." He looked at her. "That's what gardens are. Just land that knows it's being seen." He left the same way he had come, without ceremony, without lingering. The departure of a man who has said what he came to say, and trusts the words to do their work without supervision. She stood in the garden after he was gone and thought about what he had said. Land that knows it's being seen. She was still thinking about it when Jasper came through the gate at the end of the day, his hat dark with the effort of the afternoon, his hands showing the day's work. He stopped when he saw her face, that particular quality of attention she had, and he looked at her with the steady patience of a man who has learned to read her silences the way he read the sky. "Fenwick came," she said. "What did he say?" She looked at the bench with its 4 even legs. She looked at the small green growing things. She looked at the garden, which was the same ground it had always been, and also something entirely different from what it had been when she first came through the gate in the last light of her first evening here. "He said a garden is land that knows it's being seen," she said. Jasper was quiet for a moment. He looked at the garden, at the same things she had been looking at. "He's right," he said. She turned to him. He was standing just inside the gate with the evening light behind him and the expression on his face that she had learned over the weeks to read, the expression that was not quite open and not quite closed, but was the threshold between the two, the face of a man standing in a doorway, deciding whether to walk through. "Come here," she said, not as a demand, as an invitation, the kind that had an answer available but did not require one. He crossed the garden to where she stood, and he stood beside her and looked out at what they were both looking at, the recovered beds and the new growth and the bench that held its level and the evening sky coming down gold and clear over the whole of it. She took his hand. He let her. They stood like that in the garden while the light changed around them, while the gold deepened and the shadows lengthened and the small green things closed slightly against the coming cool of evening, the way growing things do, drawing inward to conserve what they had made during the day. "Ask me," she said, quietly, not a challenge, simply an opening. He turned to look at her. His face in the evening light was the face she had come to know, the one that had taken weeks to learn, and would take much longer to finish learning, the face of a man who had decided to stop leaving and was still working out what that meant. "Stay," he said. One word, the same word as before, but different now. The way a word becomes different when it is said in the right place, at the right time, by the right person, when it is not a request, but a recognition, when it means not "I need you here," but "I want you here," which are separated by the whole distance of what love actually is. She looked at him. She thought about 11 days on a stagecoach with one valise and the intention of disappearing. She thought about a room with a lock that had been oiled by someone who did not have to oil it. She thought about a diagram of wind direction folded in a pocket she still carried. She thought about a garden that was the same ground and also entirely different, because someone had decided to see it. She thought about the thread in her hands, the pattern that only makes sense once you have woven enough of it to see the whole. She thought about how you don't know what something will become until you understand what it is made of, and how you only understand what it is made of by staying long enough to learn. She had stayed long enough. "Yes," she said. The word was smaller than everything it contained. It was one syllable carrying the weight of a choice made not from necessity or fear or the absence of alternatives, but from the fullness of wanting, from the knowledge of what she was choosing and why, from the understanding that the best yes is the one you arrive at after you have honestly considered no and found it insufficient. He did not say anything else. He turned his hand in hers so that their fingers were properly laced, the way you hold something you intend to keep, and they stood in the garden while the evening came down around them and the growing things settled into the cool. And the stars began above the western hills, one first, and then another, and then the sky filling with them, the way the sky fills at the end of a clear day, gradually, and then completely. After a time, she looked at the bench. "It holds," she said. "It does," he said. She let go of his hand and went and sat on it. It was solid beneath her, 4 even legs, no tilt. She could feel the quality of the repair in it, the decision to fix something that had been listed for a long time. She looked out at the garden from the bench, and she understood what the bench was for. Not just for sitting, but for seeing from. For the particular vantage of someone who has decided to remain in a place long enough to watch it change. She looked at the small green things in the beds, the ones she did not yet know the names of, the survivors of a winter and years of inattention who had kept their roots down and waited for someone to clear the ground above them. Jasper came and stood beside the bench. He did not sit. He stood the way he stood at the edge of things when he was deciding whether to enter, and she looked up at him, and she moved slightly on the bench, making room. He sat down beside her. The bench held them both without difficulty, the way a thing built soundly holds what it is asked to hold, without drama, without effort, simply as a matter of having been made correctly, and then attended to when it needed attending. They sat in the garden in the spring evening, in the smell of turned earth, and the sound of the wind in the grass, and the particular silence of a place that has been given attention and knows it. And the light went down around them slowly, the way good things go, taking its time, leaving something in the quality of the dark that followed that was different from ordinary dark, warmer, more specific, the dark of a place that has held light and remembers it. Eveline looked at the first stars appearing above the hills. She had come here to disappear. That had been the whole of the plan, the entire architecture of it. And yet, she was more visible to herself now than she had been in years, more present in her own life than she could remember being. She turned that over slowly, the way she turned a finished length of cloth to check it in the light. Perhaps those were not opposites after all. Perhaps disappearing far enough in one direction was simply another way of arriving somewhere else entirely. Beside her, Jasper was quiet with the quietness that was his natural language, the quietness that was not absence, but presence, the quietness of a man who has learned that some things are said better by remaining than by leaving, by staying than by going, by the daily accumulated evidence of a life shared in the same direction. She leaned her shoulder against his. He did not move away. The garden breathed around them in the dark, the small green things at their roots, the soil alive beneath the surface with everything that had survived winter underground and emerged into the spring. It was the same ground it had always been. It was entirely different from what it had been. And in the kitchen window of the house behind them, the lamp was lit, warm and specific, the light of a place that expected someone to return to it